Okay, so good morning, good evening, good night, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the first of what we hope will be many SIEL Conversations. My name is Maria Laura Marceddu, and I am the moderator of this session. I work at the University of Edinburgh, where I am a teaching fellow in international economic law, and also at King's College London, where I am visiting lecturer in international investment law and fellow at the Center of European Law. Now, it is a great pleasure for us to inaugurate this series of SIEL Conversation with a discussion on Federico Ortino's latest book, The Origin and Evolution of Investment Treaty Standards, Stability, Value, and Reasonableness. Now, let me say this up front. If any of the audience member has suggestions for future topics for these SIEL conversations, please feel free to get in touch, to reach out to us through the website. Now, before starting, Peter, Marcus, and Shinji would like to say a few words. So, Peter, you have the floor.
Dear colleagues, members and friends of the Society of International Economic Law, welcome. Welcome to this very first SIEL Conversation. My name is Peter van den Bosch, and I speak to you in my capacity of President of SIEL. We live in difficult, extraordinary times. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected all of us and will continue to do so. In normal times, we would have gathered earlier this month at Bocconi University in Milan for our biannual conference. We did not, we could not. And this has been a disappointment for many, if not all of us. But this disappointment pales against the human sorrow and economic hardship that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused and continues to cause to many around the world, and perhaps to some of you personally. Any crisis, however, also brings opportunities. Opportunities to overcome difficulties, opportunities to adapt to a changed reality, opportunities to reinvent oneself, and opportunities to start something new. And that is what SIEL is doing today. Today, we launch SIEL Conversations, a monthly webinar to discuss a newly published remarkable book or paper or an important development in the field of international economic law. I'm very happy to welcome to this first SIEL Conversation over 370 registered participants from all over the world. For some of you, as Maria Laura already indicated, for some of you it's still very, very early in the morning, and for some of you it's getting quite late. I hope, and I'm confident, that all of you will find this first and all subsequent SIEL Conversations worthy of your attention. Now, with these brief words of welcome, I will now give the floor to Shinji Penny, but not before congratulating Maria Laura with having suggested and pushed for this new SIEL activity. Shinji, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Shinji Penny. I'm one of the vice presidents of the society. First of all, let me say that we are overwhelmed by the enthusiasm for our initiative to launch these SIEL Conversations. We are truly thankful to all participants. It's good to welcome so many colleagues, friends, and new faces. And indeed, as Peter mentioned, it was disappointing having to cancel the 2020 SIEL conference due to the pandemic. But we would like to take this opportunity to express our appreciation to all those who have committed countless hours to what promised to be an exciting 2020 SIEL conference. In particular, we thank our colleagues at Bocconi University and the members of the organizing committee. And we are now moving forward with planning the 2021 SIEL conference, and we will post the new call for papers later this year. So we look forward to your participation in the next SIEL Global Conference. And thank you again for joining us today. Before I hand over to Marcus, we are interested in how you found us. And for that reason, we are going to launch a quick poll, which we ask you to answer in the next minute or so. Thank you very much. Marcus?
Thanks so much, Xinyi. And as Xinyi said, my name is Marcus Wagner. I'm the other vice president of SIEL, or SIEL, as a former president of the organization has said or pronounces us. It's very good, I think, to see you and for you to see SIEL continue its activities, as Peter has said. Keep an eye out for the next iterations of the SIEL Conversations, which will take place roughly every month. We're thinking about having SIEL Conversations on online litigation amongst IEL institutions, for example, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and teaching international economic law under these new conditions. And let me also express our hope as an organization that we will be able to meet again in person very, very soon. Before I hand back to Maria Laura, thank you, number one, for joining us, everyone. Thanks to the members of the Executive Council for their support for SIEL Conversations, and in particular, Suresh Nanvani, and Maria Laura for being the driving force behind all of this. And with those words of thanks, I'll hand over to Maria Laura, who will be moderating today's session.
Okay, so, well, thank you very much for your kind words. Now, a few practical information. As you might have noticed, attendees will not be able to use camera and microphones, but you can still submit your questions through the Q&A function, also anonymously if you wish. Now, the idea is to have a very interactive conversation and constantly engage with the public, so feel free to jump in and submit your questions at all times. We would like to stick to the 1 hour allotted time frame, but of course, do not hesitate to get in touch with any one of us should you still have questions that, I don't know, keep you up at night. Of course, they have to be book related or SIEL related. And lastly, the record of this first conversation will be available on the SIEL YouTube channel shortly after this event. Now, on to speaker's introduction. Well, to be honest, none of them need to be introduced, but it's my job, so here we go. At the very bottom, no, now we move. Where is, well, below me, Federico Ortino, who is joining us from London, where he is reader in international economic law at King's College London and consultant in the International Trade Law Group at Clifford Chance. And Federico is also one of the founding fathers of the Society of International Economic Law, and of course is the author of the book we're going to discuss today. To my right, Tania, who is joining us from Melbourne. She is professor at Melbourne Law School, and she's a former legal officer of the Appellate Body Secretariat of the World Trade Organization. And then in the left corner, Michael Waibel, who is joining us from Vienna, where he is professor in international law at the University of Vienna. Okay, now let's spice up the discussion with a little quiz for the audience. The question is quite simple. How often have you come across a stabilization clause in an investment treaty. And you can choose among 4 options: very often, often, rarely, and never. Now, here. Well, I give you a few more seconds to cast your vote. Let me briefly say that in the presence of a stabilization clause, the regulatory framework applicable to the covered foreign investment at the time of its submission to the host state is frozen. By way of example, I have copied Article 11.3 of the 1996 Italy-Jordan BIT in the webinar chat, so that everyone has an idea of on what a stabilization or freezing clause is and how it looks like. Now, it seems that we have a split audience because around 40% has often or rarely heard of a freezing clause. So let's start with a question for the author now. In chapter 1, you claim that there appears to be very little awareness over investment treaties, stabilization or freezing clause. Now, how can you explain this lack of awareness? I mean, provision like the fair and equitable treatment can be seen as the product, of negotiations among diplomats or governmental representatives, perhaps not extremely familiar with legal technicalities. A provision like a freezing clause, however, applies to all current and future investment covered by an investment treaty and make this investment immune, froze investment, and make them immune to subsequent regulatory activities. Now, I thought about the idea that behind the insertion of clauses like this was the pursuit of liberalization, although I must admit it seems a bit far-fetched. So I started to wonder whether the consequences of clauses like this were completely unforeseeable, or whether states deliberately decided to ignore them. And hence my question, how can you explain this lack of awareness over stabilization clauses?
So this is my turn. Hello, and
Yes.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here, and thank the organizer for inviting me to this new exciting activity by the society. I mean, it does feel, I have to say just shortly, that given the number of registered participants you mentioned, I asked myself whether this is sort of the online version of a rave these days, particularly also the time frame in which this is taking place. But I haven't ever been to one, so I have no idea. Maybe we can have a poll about that later. To your question, Maria Laura, it's a good question, and I don't really have an answer. Why the lack of awareness? I remember stumbling upon a stabilization clause in an investment treaty quite a while ago. I was doing Chester Brown had asked me to do a commentary as part of his book on the model BIT of Italy. And reading the model BIT of Italy of 2003, I sort of stumbled upon a clause that looks a bit like the one you put up on the chat. And I was surprised, sort of shocked, actually. But, stabilization clauses at that time, this is about 10 years ago, were quite well known, but in a contract context, not in a treaty context. And so I did ask, I remember asking a few of sort of colleagues, friends, and the answer I usually get is yes, a contract clause, but really few knew about the existence of such clauses in investment treaties. Now, I think, in truth, perhaps the one reason I would point to is that there are very few of these clauses in treaties. And funny enough, it is Italy that, to my limited research, has used it, not only in its model BIT, but also in actual investment treaties. Now,
on this point,
yes.
I was surprised to learn that actually Italy included these freezing clauses more frequently than other capital exporting countries. Any thought on the reasons underpinning this choice? Also, I couldn't really find an investment arbitration on the application of these clauses that involved Italy, but perhaps I overlooked something.
Well, I haven't managed to find one either. And it's actually quite interesting because although there's few of these clauses, you know, through the MFN clause, you would wonder, in fact, you would expect then becoming more applicable in a wider set of contexts. But I don't think there hasn't, and also thinking about the recent cases against Italy, again, I'm not aware whether such an argument has even been put forward by claimants, but I haven't heard them having been used or referred to, whether in claimants' memorials or in a tribunal award. So yes, I'm with you. The origin, I mean, how did they end up there? Now, they do look a lot like contractual stabilization clauses. So I imagine that somebody advising or even somebody trying to sort of put forward certain views when these treaties were negotiated by Italy suggested the inclusion of such a clause in the treaty. I mean, I think it's quite complicated, complex. Sometimes it doesn't work where an investor tries to put a stabilization clause in their underlying contract. But if you have it already in an applicable treaty, that really makes their life much more simple. So I think that sort of my hunch is that's where they come from. This is something that I've thought about doing, you know, sort of tracing back, you know, the history. If I could find one, this would involve a trip to Rome, perhaps, which wouldn't be a bad idea. Maybe not under these circumstances, but this is something that I have been thinking about doing, actually.
Still about this phrasing clauses, about remedies. I mean, chances are that the remedy an investor would obtain for a breach of the phrasing clause would probably be lower than the remedy the investor would be able to obtain at the expropriation of court. So does the penalty make any sense? Also consider the regulatory chill that a phrasing clause could lead to.
Yeah, but I think, you know, I think the underlying remedy depends. You know, as you know, in investment treaties, you know, when you do have a dispute, the very likely remedy that an investor either will demand or will get is compensation, is damages. So I think that's what one will get. I think in theory, there isn't really any difference between a breach of this clause and a breach of any other treaty clause. And it would depend, you know, the amount would depend on the amount of harm that the investor had suffered because of the alleged breach. So that I don't think that would change dramatically, and it would still be, you know, all the potential regulatory chill that apply to any treaty obligations would equally apply to this clause.
Okay, in 2009, the UNSG Special Representative for Business and Human Rights identified a potentially more nuanced version of these phrasing clauses, and they call it the economic equilibrium clause, which comes in two versions. They identified a rigid version under which changes in the law would apply to the investor, but the state would indemnify the investor for its compliance with the new legislation. Then there was also a more flexible equilibrium clause, under which the state and the investor would commit to conducting future negotiations with the goal of recalibrating the original allocation of risk and gains based on the reality of the new legislation. Now, do you think that this option 2, that probably using the language of your book could be labeled a soft equilibrium clause, could be a good compromise to ensure regulatory freedom without neglecting investment protection?
Well, I mean, the short answer is no. Whether it's a strict freezing clause or a softer economic equilibrium clause, I think they are the same kind. It's a stabilization clause. Even in the softer sense, the softer equilibrium clause would require adjustments to the underlying deal. Now, remember, this is the study done by the IFC, led by John Ruggie and Andrea Schemberg, was focused on contractual stabilization clauses. So in the context of a treaty dispute, that readjustment of the underlying deal may not even be possible, as there may not be an investment contract. But even in that case, I think that readjustment would still involve some sort of financial compensation, whether it's directly or indirectly. So it would. There isn't really a difference in what a softer economic equilibrium clause is compared to a strict freezing clause.
Okay, thank you. Since we are talking about equilibrium, we just have a question from the audience. And the question is if you foresee any impact of the current populism, nationalism wave on the foreign investment regime.
Wow, yes, that is a big question. Of course, I mean, I think again the short answer is yes. It may have, it will have in some countries more than other, perhaps. We're already seeing, whether they are always justified or not. I think, perhaps the middle position is that extreme nationalism may sometimes go overboard, whereas some legitimate concerns have been made and expressed recently, which have led to some rethinking about the extent to which the international investment regime should be structured and framed. And so that's sort of, these are the discussions we are having at the moment, whether it's about investment liberalization, whether it's about investor-state dispute settlement, or the substantive protections in investment treaty.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really insightful. And now I think it's time for Tania to bomb you with questions. So Tania, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria Laura, and thank you for the invitation to join tonight. I'm really happy to be here. So Federico, I really enjoyed reading the book, and what I'd like to ask you about is first a couple of questions about chapter 2, where you're talking about indirect expropriation. So in that chapter, you explain the evolution of the indirect expropriation obligation from, you say, a guarantee of the value of the protected foreign investment to a guarantee vis-a-vis the host state's unreasonable conduct. And to me, this seems to be a movement towards the concept of fair and equitable treatment. So do you see these obligations as converging, either in terms of their interpretation and application by tribunals or in terms of their treatment in modern investment treaties?
Yes, so the short answer is yes, to some extent, but perhaps let me explain a little bit, because this is, I don't know whether many of our viewers have had the chance to look at the book. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't really understand expropriation like FET. What is he talking about? Well, I think so. Everybody knows about the two different doctrines that have developed over the years with regard to the interpretation of the concept of indirect expropriation, right? The sole effect doctrine and the police powers doctrine. But I think these two doctrines, depending on whether one chooses one or the other, they're not just simply two different ways to define indirect expropriation, but they also encapsulate two different legal guarantees. So if you define indirect expropriation based on the sole effect doctrine, this leads to a guarantee, a protection norm against any substantial deprivation of potentially the value of the foreign investment. So in this context, there's no reference to, no relevance of the public policy underlying the allegedly expropriatory measure. And so it's just about the impact, right? It has to be substantial, the impact. Now, if you take the second doctrine, the police powers doctrine, then this sort of leads to a different underlying legal guarantee norm, I would say. And it's a guarantee against any unreasonable substantial deprivation of the value of the foreign investment. So, and in this sense, the existence of deprivation sort of becomes a minor, sort of a threshold question, but whether the allegedly expropriatory measure is a legitimate, reasonable, sound exercise of regulatory authority becomes really the underlying normative content. And so in this way, so if you assume that more recently tribunals have actually, particularly when defining indirect expropriation, have actually pointed to the police powers doctrine as sort of the leading way to define an expropriation, then you could argue that there has been a convergence towards a reasonable base norms similar to the fair and equitable treatment standard.
Thank you. And this leads on from what you were saying. So in the book you say, as you've just stated, that as part of this evolution of the indirect expropriation obligation, the tables have turned, you say, from a majority approach deciding cases according to the sole effect doctrine towards a majority approach tending instead towards the police powers doctrine. And this is in part due to developments in treaty practice. And you also point out that successful invocations of the expropriation doctrine are more likely to be typically linked with the sole effect doctrine. So does this change then mean that expropriation is being harder to make out and therefore that FET is becoming more important? Yes,
I mean, definitely. I think, if you look at the practice, expropriation, as whether direct or indirect, and the practice that mainly focus on the latter, has always been more difficult. Even under a sole effect doctrine scenario, demonstrating substantial, if not total, deprivation has always been quite difficult. And there have been different ways how tribunals have recently even made it harder. Particularly, I'm thinking about the denominator question and sort of taking the whole investment, and not just the individual asset. So there have been different ways in which even under a sole effect doctrine has become quite difficult to make a case of expropriation. And has always been FET as the key, the key weapon in the hands of investors to bring and make their case against those states. And I suspect that today that is even more true because of this move from the sole effect doctrine to the police powers doctrine.
Okay, thank you. It seems that we have a couple of questions on the phrasing clauses. So if you would explain in a few words what stabilization clauses are, because some of the attendees probably missed the first bit. So if just in a few words you can catch up with them. And then there is also still on the phrasing clauses topic another question. And the question is there any correlation between phrasing clauses and their inclusion in treaties with countries, perhaps developing countries, with consistent natural resources? An intuition would be that investors in, for instance, extractive industry, which are capital intensive, are concerned about financial impact due to the regulatory changes in the host country. So would it change whether you are negotiating with a developing country, or not, and whether the investment, say, would be in natural, in extractive industry? It does make a difference.
Do you want me, so you had two questions. You want me to say something more basic about freezing clauses or stabilization clauses?
Just say a few words again, because I think some of the attendees missed the first.
Yeah, for anyone who wants to look at one, I mean, I'm not sure whether it's clear, but you know, the one that appears still, at least in front of me, on the Zoom chat, not in the question and answer, but in the Zoom chat. This is the Article 11.3 of the 1996 Italy-Jordan BIT. And it basically, I mean, if you read it, I mean, again, it's never been interpreted. So, I mean, there are sort of loopholes there, but the idea is that the investor has the ability to choose whether any new laws, regulation, acts, or measures of economic policies governing directly and indirectly investment will be, which have entered into force after it has made investment, will apply to it. So likely this gives the chance of the investor to opt out or opt in, depending on whether whether the modification of the underlying host country laws are favorable or not. I mean, that's the gist of a stabilization clause, which is similar to what you find sometimes in investment contracts. On the second question, I mean, I don't think that, so stabilization clause in investment treaties have always been rare, as I mentioned before. And I think they've been almost non-existent in the last 10 years. I would really be surprised, really, to be honest, if with the level of expertise from every side today, a country would be willing to sign up to include such a clause in their underlying treaty. So I really see as really no chance. I mean, the point you know, why are they in the book? I mean, I think they are in the book simply to make, to strengthen my argument that in their origin and the way that they developed, even before any ISDS case was brought, investment treaties were there to provide a broad set of guarantees to foreign investors. I mean, I think that's why I'm using it. I'm also using it in a sense to show that FET, which has been interpreted in some instances also as a protection of legal stability, is perhaps, you know, that interpretation may be misled by the fact that if a treaty, a contracting party wanted to include a stabilization obligation, that's the way you would do it, through a proper stabilization clause. So I would stop here.
Okay, we have a couple of questions here on this idea of equilibrium. One is about the call on ISDS moratorium during the pandemic. And the question is, what do we think, what is our view on this call and how this moratorium would address the regulatory challenge states may otherwise face during a pandemic?
I don't know. Look, I mean, I think this is probably sure. If countries, contracting parties are the masters of the system. If they want to end it, they should. If they want to suspend it, they should. The question about and there may be a situation where this is to be suggested. Although I find some operational issues. You know, how long will it last, and who does it apply to? I mean, I think, you know, aside from the pandemic, we should have, and in fact, countries are doing this, reviewing their own investment policies, their own investment treaties, and making sure that they actually are up to speed with what they want to be bound by under certain limits. And so, and if at the end of that process a country decides to scrap the entire investment protection, so be it. So I would limit myself to that.
Yeah, since this was a question to all the panelists, Tania, Michael, would you like to say a few words on this, on the moratorium? No? Well, Tania, muted yourself, so you were going to say something.
So I think it's, you know, in principle, it's a good idea, because I think that there are a number of things that countries could be doing that might seem to be a violation of investment treaties, and that obviously there's better use that can be done and better efforts that resources can be put towards rather than fighting these kinds of claims. I guess there is, of course, still a possibility of abuse where a country might be just using this as an excuse to carry out nationalizations or other kinds of conduct that might be problematic in normal times. But I think perhaps, as Federico said, there's a concern also about the parameters of it and how you would limit it to prevent those kinds of abuses.
Okay, Michael, would you like to?
Sure, thank you. Maybe just two quick points on that. I mean, I think these calls for the moratorium on investment treaty claims, that's of course not the only area where we see such calls. We already have, the G20 has already agreed a moratorium until the end of this year for sovereign debt repayments, so interest payments are suspended for most developing countries. But as Federico highlighted, I agree that a big challenge in any moratorium, whether it's an investment treaty claim or any other, is to determine when does it come to an end. And I don't think that's by any means straightforward. So that requires a lot more thinking. And the longer it goes on, the greater also is likely going to be the risk of abuse.
Okay, thank you. So I think on this note, where it's going to end, we are ready to slowly move towards chapter number 3. Spoiler alert, chapter number 3 is about reasonableness. And I think I can give the floor to Tania and Michael for further questions to Federico. Tania, you have the floor.
Michael, I think Michael should go.
Okay, sure. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm also, just to say, I'm also very delighted to be here for the first SIEL conversation. Thank you very much for the invitation. Now onto my questions, primarily on chapter 3. Federico, in the book, in chapter 3, you refer to a spectrum of approaches to reasonableness, and you identify two by way of example, namely means, ends, rationality, and proportionality, Jonathan Bonniccia, in his book, distinguishes between 4 approaches: the no substantive review approach on one end of the spectrum, the margin of appreciation approach, politics as irrationality, and proportionality as at the other end of the spectrum. Can you tell us a bit more about which specific approach to reasonableness, in your view, should be employed?
Mm. Well, no, that's, yeah, so Jonathan's work has been quite important, and you'll find it referred to in the book often. It is, look, in the book, I'm not sure, the book tries to mostly to set out, sort of to put out a broad legal framework to describe the system. It doesn't really take a stance, a clear normative stance. Maybe that's one of its failings. I mean, but I've written on it in other contexts, and I think it should not come as a surprise that I do find 2 problems with it. The first one is the lack of consistency, right? And this is what the book does. It shows that even when tribunals have interpreted the same provision in the same sort of manner, say as a reasonable based standard, they have differed in the extent to which they have been willing to probe into a host state regulatory sphere. And as you say, I mean, I take those 2 tests because they are often referred to by arbitral practice, and they are quite well known in legal scholarship, also at the domestic level, between a more differential mean test, rationality test, and the actual proportionality balancing test. And so that's one problem, the problem of lack of consistency, with all the ramification of the fact that a tribunal may undergo a different kind of review. Now, in terms of what should be, so my position has always been that an investment tribunal under an investment treaty should not perform strict proportionality balancing. This is for many reasons, but I'll just give you one. The proportionality balancing involves taking into account and attribute value to different interests. This is sort of, the balancing act, weighing different values, investment protection on one hand, and the right to protest by the citizens against a waste landfill. And I think investment tribunals should not be put on, there to solve those tensions. So I take this view, maybe it's not clear in the book, but I've published it elsewhere, that a means and rationality test is what investment tribunal should be limited in their review.
Can I follow just with a related question about this range of the tests, from the more deferential end that you're talking about, means and rationality, to the more intrusive end, which you give the example of proportionality balancing. And so this range of tests in international investment law, Federico, how do you see it as comparing to the similar tests that come before domestic systems, for example, in administrative and constitutional law settings, and what can we learn from the answers given in domestic settings?
Well, that's, so it's very useful. I mean, this is, we go back to Thomas Velde, the late Professor Thomas Velde's separate opinion in Thunderbird. This is now almost 15 years ago, where he did make reference to various comparative, not just public law, also private law to sort of strengthen its case or its interpretation. So I think the value of comparative law in this sphere is enormous. However, it doesn't mean that one should sort of get inspiration from and transfer doctrines or principles or tests developed at the domestic level and just transfer it to the international, in this case, the investment treaty level. I mean, I think that is perhaps what some arbitral tribunals have done. So, again, I refer to, TECMIT, where they take inspiration from the European Court of Human Rights, and they, the way they've developed the proportionality analysis for the purposes of determining an expropriation. I think that's where, where the easy transfer of doctrine from the domestic to the international is a problem.
Since we are 12 minutes left, let's pick up some questions. So the first one is from Caroline. Hi, Federico. In your view, would it be appropriate for any future multilateral investment court to engage in some sort of balancing that is inappropriate for tribunals to undertake? Why not? And then I think another one that can go along with this question could be, what do you think of the new practice of including right to regulate clauses in PIPs or investment chapters in FTA? Is some kind of clause without real practical effect in investment cases, or will it shape considerably investment standards in the future? And I think also I will add this third one. How do you understand the relationship between customary minimum standard on the one hand and the convergence of expropriation and FET on a common test of reasonable regulation? Is reasonableness as articulated by investment tribunal the new mirror?
Okay, let me start with the first two. Balancing by the multilateral court. No. My argument that an investment tribunal should not do strict balancing applies whether it's an ISDS tribunal or a multilateral court. As long as the underlying treaty that the tribunal is operating under is just monothematic, like investment protection, then there is no way that they should perform any balancing, and so I would suggest the same for the multilateral court. Now, the multilateral court, as it is envisaged at the moment, simply will apply existing treaties, and so on that basis, I would say no. On the right to regulate clause, I think yes. I mean, everything helps, like preambular language helps, it provides context, it provides object and purpose. So they are useful. At the same time, I think they should be focused on the actual substantive provisions and how they are written, drafted. Particularly, I think there should be clarity about the kind of standard of review that a future tribunal will perform. I think this is where even the most recent text that do try to advance a more limited, I would say maybe a more enlightened view of investment protection fail by leaving a margin of uncertainty with regard to the underlying standard of review. Basically, is it means and rationality, or is it proportionality balancing? What was the third question? Maybe I can find it in the chat.
Yes, let me see, because I can't see it on my screen either. Yes, that one. It was the relationship between customary minimum standard and convergence on expropriation and FET on a common test of reasonable regulation. Is
Yes.
reasonableness the new near?
Yes, definitely. Has always been, in fact. It's always been. This is the beauty of, I take in the book, I take reasonableness as a very, in a very broad sense. You can also have a narrow view of reasonableness, which is sort of in some system is closer to arbitrariness, in others is a bit broader. But I take a broad view, particularly to highlight the difference with the other two kinds of guarantees, protecting stability and protecting the value of the investment. And I use it in a broad sense to show that, a reasonableness-based standard is one that, at a minimum, focuses on the underlying public policy justification of the measure under review. So this is what, in fact, does not happen in what I describe as guarantees against stability in the strict sense and guarantees of the value of the investment. In those two scenarios, there is, the relevance of the underlying public policy of the measure is zero. Whereas in a reasonableness-based standard or setting, that becomes a central consideration.
Great. I think Michael has probably one last question for you.
Sure, thank you. So I was wondering, what, in your view, is the role of legitimate expectations with respect to stability and reasonableness? And do you think legitimate expectations offer a better, more nuanced approach to stability in particular than stabilization clauses in either investment treaties or investment contracts?
Yes. However, there's a caveat. It has to be applied properly. So this is also a point I try to make in the book, that the concept of the protection of legitimate expectation has often been applied in investment arbitration, not based on sort of the orthodox view that is the case in domestic legal systems. Particularly, what has been lacked is a clear focus on whether a legitimate expectation should indeed be protected, taking into account any overriding public interest. This is an aspect that is common in the way that the doctrine has been applied in the domestic legal system. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why the doctrine has really very rarely led to any success. In the investment treaty context, that part of the doctrine has somewhat went missing. There are some references here and there. In fact, even Thomas Welde, in his sort of pro-legitimate expectation opinion in Thunderbird, does refer to that overriding public interest prong, but I'm not quite sure whether he actually went through it in terms of applying it to the specific case there. So yes, but with this big important caveat.
Okay, let's take another couple of questions from the audience. Well, these two are on FET, so let's blend them together. Okay, so the first one. How do you see the future of expropriation and FET claims in intra-EU cases once the intra-EU BITs are terminated? Will there be an increased role for expropriation and human rights arguments to the detriment of FET arguments, with the ensuing lower protection for investors? And then the other one, new generation treaties have avoided the equity standard, but have relied on minimum standard under customary international law. Do you feel this could lead to challenges of interpretation, considering the uncertain contours of the customary international law standard?
For the first question, I struggle to see if intra-EU bits are terminated in the way that there is planned, i.e. no survival clause, although I'm sure that some will argue that still the survival clause will apply, but I think it's a weak argument. There is going to be any treaty claims, at least, I mean, existing one, they're trying to deal with existing one, but certainly no future claims be brought under those arguments. I mean, you may have to rely on anything else that is out there, domestic law, the European Convention of Human Rights, but not investment treaties. I didn't quite understand the second bit, whether, am I reading the question as can legitimate expectation be transferred to subsequent treaty parties?
No.
Sorry,
that's
no, that's
another question. It's on the top of the Q&A box.
Okay.
It's the relationship between FET and customary international, the minimum standard under customary international law.
Right, I see, the generation treaties about it. Well, I mean, I think I don't really want to talk a lot about customary international law because it's a difficult topic and it's quite a complex topic that one should not underestimate. I think, eventually treaty practice will influence, the content of custom, but that's, that's an issue on its own. I see there's a question at the very bottom by Audley. Would it be better if stabilization clauses just apply to tax laws? Now, it's interesting that in fact, the Italian model BIT takes a broad, sort of espouses a broad stabilization clause, i.e. one that applies to any modification, to any laws, regulation. But there have been cases in investment treaties where the stabilization clause only applies to certain areas. Sometimes, I found cases where they apply to currency exchanges, so very narrowly drawn. Now, you could argue that maybe by limiting it, to specific instances like tax law, that may be more acceptable to contracting parties. Although if you think about that, I'm not sure how many host states, whether capital importing, capital exporting, would be happy to actually do that. But that's certainly not only because they're not granting these clauses to a specific transaction, to a specific contract, but they were granting it broadly to an unlimited set of foreign investors.
One last question. It's a follow-up on transferring domestic legal doctrines and tests to the international level. Why do you find this so problematic? And do you think domestic doctrines and tests should not have any place at all in international settings?
No, that's not true. I mean, I think it could be the case, but I don't think we are here at the international level inventing new legal doctrines and tests. I mean, I think, maybe in some situation that is necessary, but I think, legal systems have developed over hundreds of years, and there's plenty of examples or principles that can be borrowed. But I think, the borrowing has to be done accordingly. The problematic aspect is because many of these doctrines, particularly when it's about judicial review, not only administrative, but also legislative, so at the level of constitutional, take place under a different, more complex setting at the domestic level, compared to the very narrow investment law focus that takes place in the international level. And that's the problematic aspect. It's, aside from, the lack of legitimacy of some of the international tribunals, but I think it's really, it's their mandate. They lack a broad mandate to undertake the kind of balancing that does take place at the domestic level.
Okay, thank you. It's now 11 in London, so this means that our conversation is about to end. We have one last question for our participants here, just to see how many of you have been lost on the way.
Haha!
So if you're advising a capital exporting country on its future investment protection treaties, what would your advice be? And you have 4 options: include a guarantee of legal stability in the strict sense, include a guarantee against any substantial deprivation of the value of investment, include a reasonableness guarantee, all of them, none of them. Okay, while I give you a few more seconds to answer the question, I will give the floor to the panelists for some brief concluding remarks. Let's start with Tania, then Michael, and then Federico.
Hello, I don't want to keep everyone from their lunch or dinner or bed in my case, but thank you very much again for the invitation. Federico, it was a pleasure to read the book, and good night.
Michael?
Thank you. Well, I've likewise found it a very stimulating read, and I think at 175 pages also a more concise and that's a very good thing read than some other scholarship published on international investment law. So I really encourage everyone listening in who's working on investment treaty standards to take a look at Federico's book. Thanks a lot.
Federico?
So thank you both, Tania and Michael. You've been really kind. And yes, I did set 150 pages as my limit, but I failed. Explain investment treaty standards in 150 pages. I try my best. Maybe it's the footnotes. In fact, maybe it's sort of having to reference, wanting to reference all the great work you have done, Michael and Tania. Yes, thank you for the organizers, Maria Laura and SIEL for giving me the chance. I'd like to see the result of this last polling. It's quite interesting.
Here we go. Can you see them?
No, but...
I will show you later on. We have 12% include a guarantee of legal stability in the strict sense. Then 32% include a guarantee against any substantial deprivation of the value of the investment. 20% include a reasonableness guarantee, and 24% include all 3, and 14% not include any.
There you go. There you go. Good. Everything, inconsistent as the world we live in. Perfect.
Well, and on that note, I think we're going to end this conversation. As you might have noticed, this is just the beginning. We still have questions. Oh, first of all, let me join me in thanking the panelists and Federico. We hope to see you again in the future. Thank you very much for attending this first SIEL Conversation. It has been a great pleasure and honor for us to have you here. We look forward to staying in touch, and as Mark and Shini were saying, we hope also to meet you in person in the very near future. Keep an eye on our website for our next conversation, and stay safe. Have a good day. Have a good night. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.